They say history is written by the victors, but what about the stories deliberately erased by those same victors? What about the accounts buried in locked filing cabinets, stamped with red ink that read, "Classified," and forgotten beneath layers of silence? Our title today, 4 Disturbing WWII Mysteries Buried by Time, is more than a headline, it is a warning. Scattered across the globe are fragments of evidence: scorched villages in East Prussia, secret laboratories hidden behind barbed wire in Manchuria, German ships rusting beneath the Baltic Sea, and American archives filled with sanitized records of Nazi scientists welcomed onto US soil. Each of these cases carries a single thread: atrocities concealed not only by perpetrators, but by governments who feared the truth would destabilize the fragile post-war order. Tonight we open those long-buried files. Expect no tidy resolutions, no comforting narrative of good triumphing over evil. Instead, prepare to hear stories so disturbing, so corrosive, that they were scrubbed from official memory. What you are about to hear may feel like forbidden history, unearthed from the shadows of war. Chapter 1: The Erased Massacre of Nemmersdorf. The autumn of 1944 brought a new phase of terror to Europe. By October, the Wehrmacht was in retreat. German cities burned nightly under Allied bombing raids, and the Red Army was advancing westward at a relentless pace. Yet few could have imagined the horror that would unfold in a small East Prussian village called Nemmersdorf. On October 21st, the 11th Guards Army of the Soviet Union crossed the Angarap River and stormed the settlement, encountering little resistance from retreating German units. What followed became one of the most disturbing and controversial episodes of the war, an atrocity that was loudly publicized by the collapsing Nazi regime, then just as quickly buried in silence after the war ended. Contemporary reports describe scenes that defy belief. Survivors, many of them peasants, recalled women and children nailed to barn doors, elderly villagers beaten to death, and families executed in their own homes. The German Foreign Office and Propaganda Ministry rushed to broadcast the alleged massacre, inviting international journalists, diplomats, and neutral observers to view the aftermath. Swiss, Swedish, and even Spanish officials recorded statements noting the mutilated corpses. Yet, in the post-war years, the narrative of Nemmersdorf was swiftly dismissed by both the Allies and the Soviets. Official accounts framed it as a fabrication of Joseph Goebbels' propaganda machine, an exaggeration designed to stiffen German resolve. But a deeper inspection of intelligence files reveals a more troubling picture. British SIS, Secret Intelligence Service, intercepted Soviet frontline reports during this period. Declassified fragments, unearthed decades later, describe undisciplined violence by forward rifle units and mention orders to suppress accounts of civilian contact. These were not circulated to the press or Allied command. Instead, they were buried, marked with phrases like strategic discretion and not for dissemination. US Army intelligence officers stationed in Europe after the war privately noted that certain Soviet operations in East Prussia involved severe reprisals on local populations, yet the reports never saw courtroom discussion at Nuremberg. The Allies had no interest in spotlighting Soviet atrocities, while the USSR remained a crucial partner in defeating Hitler. The testimony of civilians adds weight to the story. A woman named Erna Becker, evacuated from Nemmersdorf days after the assault, told post-war German investigators of children found with their skulls crushed, women raped in front of their families, and the elderly shot point blank. Similar accounts surfaced from nearby villages such as Mettgarten and Gumbinnen, where Soviet troops pushed west. Still, the testimonies were largely disregarded in the global narrative, overshadowed by the overwhelming tide of Nazi crimes. To acknowledge Nemmersdorf would have raised uncomfortable questions. Could the liberators also be perpetrators? Could the victors of Berlin also stand accused of war crimes? One chilling detail survives in German Wehrmacht archives: photographs taken by officers who arrived at the village after its recapture. These images, some later used in Nazi propaganda reels, showed rows of civilian corpses, many with bound hands. The veracity of the photos remains debated, with historians arguing over possible staging. Yet the very fact that Allied intelligence privately considered the reports uncomfortably consistent suggests that not all was fabrication. The massacre may not have matched the grotesque theatricality of Goebbels' claims, but the suppression of evidence points to an event too damaging for post-war politics. For decades, the name Nemmersdorf faded into obscurity. In the German Democratic Republic, mention of Soviet atrocities was strictly forbidden. Even survivors who fled west were silenced under accusations of perpetuating fascist lies. In West Germany, scholars avoided the subject, wary of appearing to relativize Nazi crimes. It was not until the 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that Russian historians admitted Soviet units committed atrocities in East Prussia, though they minimized the scale. Files remain sealed in Moscow, and requests for access to Red Army military court records are routinely denied. What lingers is a fog of uncertainty, a crime documented in fragments, exaggerated for propaganda, then buried under the rubble of competing narratives. The disturbing element is not merely what may have happened in Nemmersdorf, but how the event was manipulated, erased, and forgotten. If even partial truths were obscured for strategic reasons, then what other files remain hidden? How many testimonies never reached the public because they conflicted with the story of noble liberation? The erasure of Nemmersdorf reminds us that history's silence is often deliberate. In this silence, atrocities blur into myth, and truth itself becomes collateral damage in the politics of war. Behind every classified stamp lies the possibility of a reality too dark, too compromising, to admit openly. Nemmersdorf is less a village on a map than a symbol of the truths deliberately left unspoken. Chapter 2: Operation Paperclip's Disturbing Origins. When the guns of the Second World War finally fell silent in May of 1945, the world believed that the architects of the Third Reich would face justice. The images of the Nuremberg trials seemed to confirm this. Stern judges, damning evidence, and the rhetoric of moral accountability. But behind the courtroom spectacle, another process was quietly unfolding. In locked offices of the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency in Washington, and in the war-ravaged ruins of Germany, Allied officers were collecting a different kind of prize. They were not gathering incriminating documents to condemn Nazis, but technical blueprints, laboratory notes, and lists of scientists whose expertise was deemed indispensable. This covert program would come to be known as Operation Paperclip, a recruitment drive that smuggled more than 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and physicians into the United States. Their war crimes were scrubbed from records, their SS affiliations erased, and their talents redirected toward American military and technological dominance. The disturbing origins of this operation lie not only in the pragmatic desperation of the Cold War, but in the willingness to trade justice for power. The names of these men are familiar today for their scientific achievements, but often sanitized of their past. Werner von Braun, the charismatic rocket engineer, became the face of NASA's Apollo program. Yet in 1943, von Braun stood in Mittelwerk tunnels where thousands of slave laborers from Dora Mittelbau concentration camp died assembling his V-2 rockets. Survivors remembered corpses hanging from cranes as warnings, a daily reminder of the price of progress. US Army Counterintelligence Corps documents, declassified in the 1980s, acknowledged von Braun's SS rank and personal visits to the camps. Still, he was granted citizenship, celebrated on American television, and buried with honors in Virginia. He was not the only one. Dr. Hubertus Strughold, later praised as the father of space medicine, was implicated in high-altitude and freezing experiments performed on Dachau inmates. Prisoners were locked into low-pressure chambers until their lungs collapsed, or immersed in icy water until their hearts stopped. Yet Strughold too was shielded, his files scrubbed of incriminating testimony, and he went on to establish America's Aeromedical Research Laboratory in Texas. The disturbing reality is that Paperclip was never simply about securing German technology. It was a race against the Soviet Union. By late 1945, Stalin's forces had already seized German scientists in Saxony and Thuringia, transporting them east in Operation Osoaviakhim. The Americans feared losing the technological edge. The files reveal that captured German specialists were classified not by their moral record but by their utility. Rating. An engineer who had designed slave labor facilities was no less valuable if he could build jet propulsion systems for the US Air Force. In November 1945, a directive from the Joint Chiefs of Staff explicitly authorized the exploitation of selected German scientists, overriding earlier bans on individuals affiliated with the Nazi Party or SS. From that moment, morality was subordinated to strategy. The deception was systematic. Files were rewritten, incriminating evidence reclassified. The CIC even forged biographies to omit SS service or Nazi Party membership. A 1947 memorandum to President Truman, who had initially prohibited the recruitment of Nazis, advised presenting candidates as technically essential while minimizing political exposure. Truman approved, perhaps without grasping the extent of the cover-up. By 1950, Paperclip scientists were deeply embedded in US defense projects, developing jet aircraft, guided missiles, and chemical warfare programs. At Fort Bliss in Texas and White Sands in New Mexico, former German officers instructed American soldiers in V2 operations, often speaking with thick accents that betrayed their past. The most disturbing revelations come not from who was recruited, but from what knowledge was preserved. At Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, crates of documents from Dachau's medical experiments were stored, analyzed, and in some cases, adapted into US military research. Survivors who testified about these experiments found their voices muted. The trials at Nuremberg condemned 23 Nazi doctors, but many others avoided prosecution thanks to American protection. Files from the Judge Advocate General's office indicate that witnesses implicating Paperclip candidates were deliberately excluded from proceedings. One survivor's statement, describing hypothermia trials under Strughold's supervision, was marked with the phrase, "Retain, not to be used." Justice was sacrificed for convenience. Operation Paperclip did not end in the 1940s. It extended well into the 1960s, with scientists contributing to nuclear weapons design, aerospace medicine, and psychological warfare programs. The Central Intelligence Agency exploited German knowledge for MK-Ultra experiments, testing drugs and interrogation techniques inspired by wartime studies. The legacy of Paperclip thus bleeds into the darkest corners of the Cold War. The very crimes that should have been prosecuted were instead institutionalized, hidden beneath classified seals. The moral compromise has never been fully acknowledged. In 1985, the US Department of Justice created the Office of Special Investigations to track down Nazi war criminals living in America. But by then, most Paperclip recruits had lived long lives, enjoyed professional accolades, and retired comfortably. Some had even been awarded NASA medals, Air Force commendations, or presidential honors. Victims were left with nothing but the memory of screams in underground tunnels, of bodies frozen in ice baths, of lungs collapsing in pressure chambers. Their suffering was repurposed as data points in American laboratories. The disturbing origins of Operation Paperclip show us that the line between victor and villain was not as clean as the official narrative suggests. In the race to outpace Moscow, Washington willingly struck Faustian bargains. The story was buried not because it lacked evidence, but because the evidence was too damning. The files speak plainly, names erased, records cleansed, crimes ignored. What remains is an uncomfortable truth, that the foundations of American spaceflight, aerospace medicine, and Cold War military science were built upon the bodies of the forgotten dead. And for decades, the nation that promised justice instead built rockets. Chapter 3: The Forbidden Convoys of Operation Hannibal. In January of 1945, the German Reich was collapsing on every front. The Red Army was pushing relentlessly into East Prussia, Silesia, and Pomerania, advancing with a vengeance fueled by years of Nazi atrocities on Soviet soil. For millions of German civilians living in these regions, the approach of Soviet forces was more than a military maneuver. It was an existential terror. In this desperate climate, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz authorized a massive evacuation by sea. It would be codenamed Operation Hannibal, and it would ultimately become the largest seaborne evacuation in recorded history, dwarfing even Dunkirk. Over a span of 4 months, more than 2 million soldiers, civilians, and officials fled aboard warships, fishing boats, ferries, and requisitioned liners. Yet buried beneath the vast human tragedy lies a more disturbing undercurrent. Intelligence files, survivor testimonies, and fragments of lost manifests suggest that Hannibal was not only about rescuing civilians. It may also have served as cover for the transport of looted wealth, advanced weapons prototypes, and secret SS divisions whose presence was never meant to be revealed. The most infamous episode of Operation Hannibal is the sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff on January 30th, 1945. Once a luxury liner for the Nazi leisure organization Kraft durch Freude, the ship had been repurposed as a transport vessel. That night, it carried more than 10,000 souls, including wounded soldiers, U-boat trainees, and thousands of civilians, women and children, packed into every available space. At 9:16 p.m., 3 torpedoes fired by Soviet submarine S-13 slammed into its side. Within 45 minutes, the ship capsized and sank into the icy Baltic. The death toll reached nearly 9,000, making it the deadliest maritime disaster in history. Yet what official records rarely mention is the special cargo allegedly loaded at Gottenhafen before departure. Survivors recalled guarded compartments sealed by SS officers, off limits even as the decks overflowed with refugees. Rumors circulated that these holds contained stolen art, crates of Reichsbank gold, or even experimental weapons meant to evade capture. None of these items were ever recovered, but intelligence intercepts from the time reference priority consignments, leaving East Prussia under direct SS supervision. The Wilhelm Gustloff was not the only ship with unanswered questions. Other vessels, such as the General von Steuben and the Goya, both later sunk, were also rumoured to be carrying more than human cargo. A declassified British naval intelligence file, dated March 1945, refers cryptically to materials in sealed compartments lost in Baltic sinkings. Though the file does not elaborate, its wording suggests cargo deemed strategically significant. At the time, the Allies were desperate to intercept German nuclear and rocket research. Operation Alsos, conducted by American and British intelligence, had scoured Europe for uranium stockpiles and V2 components. If the SS had indeed attempted to smuggle prototypes or documents aboard evacuation ships, their loss at sea may explain why fragments of Germany's advanced weapons programs never resurfaced. Survivors of Hannibal described scenes of unimaginable chaos. Civilians boarded in snowstorms, carrying what little they could. Mothers pressed infants into the arms of strangers, hoping at least someone would reach safety. Yet amid the panic, witnesses noted the presence of heavily armed SS detachments who boarded certain ships first, often escorting locked containers. In some accounts, guards were posted outside these compartments, even as civilians froze on deck. When torpedoes struck and panic erupted, those compartments were never opened. Some survivors claimed they heard pounding from within as the ships went down. Whether those holds contained military personnel, stolen assets, or experimental cargo, no one was permitted entry. The secrecy was absolute, and after the war, the records of what had been loaded vanished. Post-war investigations into Hannibal were minimal. Unlike Dunkirk, celebrated as an act of survival, Hannibal was overshadowed by the enormity of Nazi defeat. The Allies were focused on Nuremberg, denazification, and the division of occupied Germany. The evacuation was relegated to footnotes, its scale too uncomfortable to acknowledge when set against the crimes of the Reich. But buried in the Bundesarchive are references to missing manifests, marked lost in war chaos. A 1952 West German parliamentary inquiry into missing persons briefly touched on Hannibal, but key documents had been destroyed or withheld. The inquiry concluded that no complete accounting can be made. Silence replaced scrutiny. The Baltic itself became a watery grave not only for civilians, but for history. Divers in the 1990s rediscovered the wrecks of the Gustloff, the Steuben, and the Goya, lying shattered on the seabed. Their holds remain sealed, protected by German law as war graves. Attempts to penetrate them are forbidden. This has fueled speculation. If there were cargo aboard, it will remain hidden indefinitely. Russian naval divers have also been suspected of accessing some wrecks during the Cold War, but no public record confirms what, if anything, was removed. The secrecy surrounding these sites perpetuates the mystery. Are they merely graves of civilians? Or are they tombs for secrets the SS intended never to surface? The disturbing legacy of Operation Hannibal is twofold. On one level, it was a humanitarian catastrophe of staggering proportions, tens of thousands drowned in freezing waters, their names lost in chaos. On another level, it may have been a deliberate cover for clandestine transfers. If even a fraction of the rumors are true, Hannibal represents not just desperation, but calculation, the attempt of a dying regime to spirit away its treasures, technology, and personnel beneath the cloak of civilian tragedy. To this day, fragments of testimony whisper of SS units vanishing during the evacuation, their records erased, their fates unknown. Were they lost at sea, or did some slip quietly into exile, carrying with them the knowledge the Reich hoped to preserve? Operation Hannibal remains forbidden not simply because of its scale, but because of the unanswered questions that linger beneath the waves. For the survivors, the memory is one of frostbitten nights, lifeboats capsized in black water, and children's cries swallowed by the sea. For historians, it is the void of missing files, erased manifests, and sealed wrecks. And for governments, it is the spectre of secrets still lying in darkness, too dangerous, too inconvenient, or too destabilizing to uncover. The story of Hannibal is a reminder that history is not only what we know, but also what has been deliberately concealed. In those locked compartments, in those sunken hulls, in those destroyed files may lie truths that could alter how we understand the end of the war. For now, they remain forbidden, buried beneath ice, water, and silence. Chapter 4: Classified Secrets of Unit 731's Survivors. In the remote plains of Manchuria, where winter winds cut like knives across frozen rivers, the Imperial Japanese Army constructed a facility that even today remains shrouded in secrecy. It was known officially as the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. Unofficially, it was Unit 731, a vast complex of laboratories, cells, and crematoria near the city of Harbin. Between 1936 and 1945, its purpose was not prevention but experimentation. Thousands of men, women, and children, Chinese civilians, Korean laborers, Soviet prisoners, and captured Allied soldiers were subjected to biological and chemical warfare trials so brutal they defy comprehension. And yet, the most disturbing truth lies not in what Unit 731 did during the war, but in what happened afterward. When the guns fell silent, the architects of this horror should have stood trial. Instead, they were shielded, rewarded, and absorbed into new programs under the protective shadow of American intelligence. Unit 731's methods were meticulously recorded in files later seized by US Army investigators. Prisoners were injected with plague, cholera, anthrax, and typhus. Others were deliberately frozen until their limbs blackened with frostbite, then thawed to study gangrene. Vivisections were performed without anesthesia, with surgeons calmly recording how organs failed in real time. Some captives were tied to stakes on firing ranges while grenades exploded around them, their wounds measured with clinical precision. Entire villages in occupied China were bombed with ceramic canisters filled with infected fleas, spreading epidemics that killed tens of thousands. By 1945, Unit 731 had refined plague bombs and designed delivery systems intended to devastate enemy cities. It was a factory of death disguised as science. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, Soviet troops quickly occupied Manchuria. They captured several Unit 731 staff, including scientists from related facilities like Unit 100 and Unit 516. In December 1949, the Soviets staged the Khabarovsk war crimes trials, where 12 defendants confessed in chilling detail to the experiments. Transcripts record testimony from Major General Kawashima Kiyoshi, describing vivisections, and Colonel Karasawa Tomio acknowledging the use of plague-infected fleas against civilians. Yet in the West, these confessions were dismissed as Soviet propaganda. American authorities, specifically General Douglas MacArthur's Occupation Command, knew the truth. They had already struck a secret deal with Shiro Ishii, the commander of Unit 731, and his subordinates. In exchange for handing over their data, they would receive immunity from prosecution. This bargain was classified at the highest level, concealed even from the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. Declassified fragments from US Army Chemical Corps files reveal the depth of this collaboration. Reports labeled "Top Secret" for official use only detail shipments of documents from Japan to Fort Detrick, Maryland, where the US biological warfare program was headquartered. The files make clear that American officials viewed the human experimentation data as unique and unobtainable elsewhere. A memorandum from 1947 states bluntly, "The value to the US of Japanese BW data is of such importance to national security as to far outweigh any consideration of war crimes liability." Shiro Ishii lived quietly after the war, never charged, believed to have advised both US and Japanese research projects until his death in 1959. Other members of Unit 731 went on to occupy prestigious posts in post-war Japan, medical school professors, pharmaceutical executives, even officials in the Japanese health ministry. Their victims were erased from history while their tormentors prospered. For survivors, the silence was unbearable. Chinese families who lost relatives to plague outbreaks received no acknowledgement. Korean laborers who had been taken to Manchuria vanished without a trace, their names unrecorded. A handful of Allied prisoners of war who had been transferred to Unit 731, Americans, Australians, and British captured in the Pacific, were written off as missing in action. Their fate was buried under redactions. In 1981, a former Unit 731 member testified anonymously in Japan, describing how children had been used in vivisections. His voice cracked as he admitted, "We were told these were sacrifices for the empire." But no official apology came. The Japanese government long denied the existence of Unit 731, and to this day, textbooks in Japan often omit its crimes or frame them as unverified. The disturbing element deepens when one considers the Cold War context. By the 1950s, the United States was in a bioweapons arms race with the Soviet Union. Fort Detrick scientists pored over Ishii's data on plague and anthrax, testing aerosol dispersal methods and survivability rates. Some of this research directly influenced later US programs that experimented with releasing harmless bacteria over American cities to test dispersal patterns. Meanwhile, Soviet scientists, armed with their own captured Japanese personnel, accelerated their own biowarfare programs. The victims of Unit 731 thus became unwilling contributors to a new era of weaponized disease. The survivors' search for justice has been long and bitter. In 1997, a group of Chinese citizens filed a lawsuit in Tokyo District Court demanding recognition and compensation. They testified to losing family members in plague outbreaks and described forced experimentation on villagers. The court acknowledged the existence of Unit 731 and its atrocities, but ruled that individual victims had no right to claim compensation under international law. The verdict was a devastating blow, reinforcing the sense that their suffering had been permanently erased for political convenience. In 2002, the court finally admitted that Unit 731 had engaged in inhumane warfare, but still declined reparations. Fragments of the truth continue to surface in declassified documents. In 1995, a US Justice Department investigation confirmed that immunity had been granted to Unit 731 scientists. In 2018, Japan's National Archives quietly released a list of more than 3,000 members of the unit, their names previously hidden, yet much remains sealed. The US government has never declassified the full set of data obtained from Ishii, and Fort Detrick's archives remain restricted. The shadows surrounding Unit 731 are not accidental. They are maintained. They protect reputations, institutions, and the uneasy truth that crimes against humanity were traded like currency in the geopolitical marketplace. The legacy of Unit 731's survivors is one of silence, denial, and lost justice. For decades, the world preferred to remember Hiroshima and Nagasaki, to frame Japan as a nation of victims rather than perpetrators. The survivors of Harbin were written out of this narrative. Their suffering was considered inconvenient, their testimony suppressed, their memory a liability to Cold War alliances. To this day, the soil around Pingfang, where the facility once stood, contains bones unearthed by farmers, mute reminders of experiments that history tried to bury. The crematoria smoke has long since dispersed, but the ash of its victims remains in the earth. Unit 731 is more than a war crime. It is a reminder that truth can be deliberately suppressed when it threatens the interests of powerful nations. It reveals how victors rewrite history not only by condemning their enemies, but by protecting them when it serves strategic goals. The classified secrets of its survivors are not only the horrors they endured, but the silence forced upon them afterward. They carry the burden of a crime the world has chosen to forget, a crime buried by time, convenience, and politics. And as long as those files remain sealed, the silence itself becomes another form of atrocity. They tell us the Second World War ended in 1945. The parades, the treaties, the trials, these mark the official close of the bloodiest conflict in human history. Yet the stories we have opened here suggest otherwise. The war did not simply end. It was buried, sealed, redacted. 4 disturbing mysteries, scattered from East Prussia to Manchuria, from the frozen Baltic to the laboratories of America, reveal how truth itself became a casualty. The massacre at Nemmersdorf, erased beneath propaganda and silence. The moral compromise of Operation Paperclip, where Nazi war criminals were rebranded as pioneers. The convoys of Operation Hannibal, carrying not only civilians but secrets meant never to be found. And Unit 731, whose crimes were washed away by Cold War necessity. Each of these files was hidden for decades, deliberately excluded from the narrative of victory. They are not isolated scandals, but patterns. Patterns of concealment, of governments deciding what we may and may not remember. The war's dead are long gone, but their shadows remain, reaching through time to remind us. History is never just what is written, it is what is withheld.